All right, class, in this lesson, you are going to learn to calculate the affordability of monthly rent, determine the relationship between square footage and monthly rent, determine the lease signing cost, and then calculate moving expenses. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so for most of you, I'm assuming all of you probably do not know what to expect when you live on your own. But your first experience of independent living or living on your own without your parents will probably be in some sort of rental, and most likely a rented apartment. And when you rent an apartment, there are some terms that you need to understand. When you're the renter, the term is called a tenant. So you become a tenant, and then whoever's renting the apartment to you is called the landlord. Okay, now there are two different scenarios when you rent an apartment. They can either come furnished, so it has furniture and appliances and things like that already in there, or it will be unfurnished, which means it'll be completely empty and you'll be responsible for bringing your own furniture and appliances. Obviously, when an apartment is furnished, the rent will most likely be higher than that than the apartment that is unfurnished. Okay. Now, before you move into any apartment, there has to be a contractual agreement, and it's called a lease. And this is an agreement between the landlord and the tenant that essentially details a number of things, but the key points is the amount of rent that you're going to be paying and the length of time that you will commit to living in the apartment. Okay, and then after a lease expires or ends, when you get to the end of the term, you as the tenant can sign a new lease for a new period. So let's say, for example, you sign a lease for 1 year, and at the end of the 1 year term, you decide that you want to spend the same apartment, stay in the same apartment for another year. You could sign a new lease. The new lease could result in a rent increase. It could stay the same. Or if the landlord doesn't say anything, you could potentially continue renting on a month-to-month basis. Okay. Now, also be aware that a landlord has the right to evict you as the tenant if, for any reason, you stop paying rent or default on the lease. Okay, so you need to make sure that you're always on time with your rent and you do not default on lease. As a rule, in terms of affordability, experts typically say that the amount of money that you spend on rent should be no more than 25 to 30% of your gross income. Okay, so let's take a look at example 1. Alex makes $61,992 per year and pays about 25% of his gross monthly income in federal and state taxes. He wants to find an apartment to rent. We are to estimate how much he can afford to pay for rent each month. And then we are to determine how much money he will have left over after taxes and rent are paid. Okay, so the first thing to do is to determine what Alex's gross monthly income will be. So if we were to take $61,992 and divide that by 12 months, that's going to give us $5,416. Okay, so then we're going to take this $5,416 and we're going to take 25% of that, or account 25% of that gross towards federal and state income tax. Okay, so we're going to multiply that by 0.25, and that works out to $1,354. Okay, so if we were to subtract that from his gross, that would give us a total of $4,062. Okay, so that's what Alex would have left over after paying taxes. Now, let's assume that our rental budget is 28%. Okay. So if that is the case, then we would take $4,062 and we're going to multiply that by 0.28, and that would give us $1,137.36. Okay, so then this amount is what Alex should be spending, or the maximum that he should be spending on rent, based on experts' advice. Now that you can go up to 30%, you can go lower, but we're assuming that the budget is 28%. Okay, so then if he spends that much in rental, okay, how much will he have left over? Well, if we take $4,062 and we subtract $1,137.36, he would have $2,924.62. Okay, so that is what would be left over after taxes and rent are paid. And then, of course, this is our rental budget. Rent, affordability. Okay, and then $2,924, which would be money left over. Okay, all right, so hopefully that made sense. Let's go on to the next part. So in the past, I don't know if this is as applicable, but when rental units were available and advertised, it was usually in a magazine or newspaper, and they would use abbreviations because the amount of space used to advertise was really important. Okay, so these are some of the abbreviations. They still may be used, but because things are now mostly on the internet, all of these words are usually spelled out completely. But if you run across an acronym like BA or BTH, that really represents bathroom. BR would be bedroom, DW or D/W or DSHWR would be dishwasher, okay, and so on and so forth. I won't go through all of them, but hopefully these will kind of make sense and you should probably become familiar with them. Okay, so in addition to explaining what the apartment has to offer, ads often include the square footage of each apartment. Okay, so this is this is a number which represents the amount of floor space in the apartment. Okay, and then of course the amount of square footage determines the price or the rent of the apartment. So obviously with more space, the cost is going to be higher. Okay, now with lease signing costs, it's not just enough to have the first month's rent available. Typically, when you sign a lease, there's a lot of upfront costs involved. Okay, so for example, usually there's an application deposit which covers the cost of processing the application, pulling a credit report and things like that. That may range anywhere from $25 all the way up to $200. Then landlords typically will require you to put a security deposit. This is money given to the landlord from you as the tenant as a way to protect the landlord in the event that you as a tenant cause damage during the term of the lease to the property. Okay, if there's no damage or nothing that needs to be repaired, then this deposit is refunded to you as the tenant at the end of the lease and once you move out. Also, landlords will also require the last month's rent to be paid at the time of move-in. Okay, and they do this because it protects the landlord in the event that you, the tenant, decide to break the lease early and vacate the apartment. And so this is a way for them to at least recoup some of the money that is owed to them. Okay, so let's take a look at example 2. Okay, Rufus and Maria paid a $200 application deposit for the 1,150 square foot apartment, which equates to $1,595 in rent. They are required to provide a credit report that costs $25 and pay a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent. The landlord also requires the last month's rent at the time of signing the lease, and the broker that they use charged 10% of the yearly rent. So the question is, how much should they expect to pay to be able to move into the apartment? Okay, so here are all the different components involved in this example, and this is not unusual if you decide to rent an apartment in the future. Okay, so let's take a look at the first thing. The application deposit is $200 in this example. The credit report was $25. Okay, the security deposit is 1 month's rent, so that is $1,595. Last month's rent is also required, so that's another $1,595. And of course, when you move in, you have to pay for the first month's rent up front, so that's another $1,595. And then the broker charges 10%, so that's going to be 10% times the yearly rent, so that's going to be $1,595 times 12 months, okay? And that works out to $1,914. So if you were to add all of these costs up, it would come out to a total of $6,924, okay? So hopefully this exercise helps you to realize that if you decide to live on your own, there's a significant upfront cost that's going to take place. It's not just the monthly rent, right? So if you were to look at the advertisement and you're like, okay, I can afford that. No, that's not just it. There's all this stuff: application deposit, credit report, security deposit, first month's rent, and then of course if you use a broker to help you find an apartment, there's an additional $1,914 that you have to pay. If you find the apartment on your own, then of course you would save that amount, but that would just bring this down to about just a little over $5,000. Still a significant amount. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Then you also need to take into account moving costs, right? So when you're planning to move out of wherever you live today, you need to consider various options that are available to you. So option number 1 is the easiest, but the most expensive, which is having someone to do all of the packing, all of the loading, all of the transporting, the unloading, and unpacking for you. Option number 2, which is the cheapest, but will take the most time and effort, is do everything by yourself. And then option 3 is to do a hybrid of 1 and 2, right? So you could do part of the packing and unpacking and just hire a professional to do the moving for you. Or you can hire a professional to do all the packing and unpacking for you, and you do the loading and transporting, right? So there's a combination of things that you could do. So factors that you should consider when you're moving is how much of the work you choose to do. So the more work you do, the less costly. Also, the distance that you are moving will also play a factor, especially if you're hiring a professional, because they are going to charge you mileage or the distance. So if you're staying within the state or you're within the county, the cost may not be as high as if you move from one state to another state. And of course, if you're moving from the West Coast or East Coast and to the opposite coast, then there's a significant cost involved as well. Another thing to also take into account, which professional movers will do, is taking into account the weight and size of your belongings. Okay, so the more belongings and the heavier, the higher the cost. Also, you want to take into account the accessibility to the street, right? So for example, are you going to be moving into the first level, or are you going to be moving into a third level where an apartment has no elevator? Okay, So the number of flights of stairs we'll have to take into account. If there's an elevator, of course, that will make things a little bit easier, but the elevator sometimes is not big enough to hold some of the larger items. So you need to take that into account as well. And then the location of pickup and drop off of your items. Sometimes if you're moving from or moving to an area that is significantly dangerous or not as safe, those also factor into the costs. Okay, so you need to be aware of those as well. All right, so let's take a look at example 3. So Jay is moving from an apartment in Miami to an apartment in Orlando. So moving from one apartment to another. If Jay moves on a weekday, he's going to need to hire professional movers for more hours of packing, loading, unloading, and unpacking because his friends will not be available to help. Now, if he moves on a weekend, he can get his friends to help, cutting down the number of hours he will need to hire movers. Now, the mover, called Move Out, is a moving company that supplies movers, trucks, and moving equipment, and they have given him the following moving estimates. Okay, so if it's a weekday move, it's going to take about 6 hours of loading and unloading, 5 hours of packing and unpacking, for a total of $720. Now, if it's a weekend move, because Jay's friends will be helping out, the professional movers will only need 4 hours of loading and unloading and 2 hours of packing and unpacking for a total cost of $400. Okay. Move Out also charges a set hourly moving team rate for loading and unloading. So that's one cost, and a different set hourly moving team rate for packing and unpacking. So that's a second set of costs. Okay. And here we are to determine or figure out what each of those hourly rates are. Okay, so how do we do this? All right, so if you go back to Algebra 2, where we were looking at systems of equations, meaning we're going to need to create two equations with two variables. Okay, so let's say that 6 hours of loading and unloading, we're going to call that 6L. This is for the weekday move. I'm going to call this weekday. All right, 6L plus 5P, that's for packing and unpacking. That total cost is $720. And then weekend, that's going to be 4 hours of loading and unloading, plus 2 hours of packing, and that gives us a total of $400. Okay, so we're going to need to solve for one of these variables, and we're going to do the following. We're going to multiply this by 2, and we're going to multiply this next equation by 3, and that's going to give us the following. If we multiply that first equation by 2, this works out to 12L plus 10P is equal to 1440. And then for the second equation, multiplying the whole thing by 3, we get 12L plus 6P is equal to 1200. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is subtract this from this equation. Okay. So we subtract this entire equation. Our 12L's cancel out, and then we're left with 4P is equal to 240. Dividing both sides by 4, we find that P is equal to 60. Okay, so what this tells us already is that packing and unpacking is going to be a $60 an hour rate. Now that we know what P is, we can go ahead and plug that into either one of these equations. I'm going to pick this equation because the numbers are a little bit smaller, and I always like to operate with smaller numbers. So 4L plus 2 times 60, that's my P, that's going to equal 400. 4L plus 120 is equal to 400. We subtract 120 from both sides, and we find that 4L is equal to 280. divide both sides by 4, and L is equal to 70. Okay, so here is the hourly rate. So packing, unpacking rate is going to be $60 per hour. And then for loading and unloading, that rate is $70 per hour. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our last example. Okay, so Samantha is moving from Madison, Wisconsin to La Crosse, Wisconsin. She's going to do all of the packing and unpacking with her brother. The moving company quoted a price of $1,250 for 8 hours of loading and unloading and driving 130 miles. The company also quoted the same price if the truck drives an extra 30 miles to pick up Samantha's brother. Samantha figures that with her brother's help, she only needs to hire the mover for 6 hours. So how much does the company charge per hour for loading and unloading, and how much do they charge per mile for driving? Okay, so let's go ahead and figure that out. So here's the equation. Let's start with without the brother. Okay, without the brother, loading and unloading is going to be 8 hours. And the total mileage is going to be 130. Okay, and then with the brother, it's still going to be 8 hours. Okay, but it's going to be 160 miles. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this equation. So with the brother, the equation is going to be 8L for loading, unloading, plus 160 miles is equal to $1,250. Okay. And then without the brother, it's going to take 8 hours still, but this time it's 130 miles. Oh, I forgot. My apologies. I forgot to create the second variable, which is M for miles. Okay, and that's going to equal 1,250. All right, so this makes solving this system of equation fairly easy because we can subtract this automatically. And when we do, this works out to 30M is equal to 1,250. And then if we divide both sides by 30, I'm sorry, I did make one slight mistake. And that was Samantha figures that with her brother's help, she only needs to hire the movers for 6 hours. Okay, so let me go ahead and correct that. Hopefully you caught that as I was going through this, but if not, that's okay. So we're going to go ahead and change this equation. So this all changes now. All right, so we said with the brother, it's going to be 6 hours. Without the brother, it's going to be 8. Okay, so now we're going to have to adjust this equation. Let's go ahead and move this over a little bit. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to multiply. We're going to multiply the first equation by 4 and the second equation by 3. All right, and when we do that, we get 24L plus 640M, and that's going to equal 5,000. And then the second equation, multiplying that by 3, we get 24L plus 390M is equal to 3,750. All right, now let's go ahead and subtract those equations. And when we do, these cancel out, and we're left with 250M is equal to 1,250, which means M is equal to 5. 50. 5? It's 5, okay? So that's going to be 5. M is my 5, so that's going to be $5 per mile. And then, so if we were to take this M equal to 5 and plug that back into, let's say, the second equation, we're going to get 8L plus 130 times 5 is equal to 1,250. 8L plus, this works out to 650 is equal to 1,250. Subtracting 650 from both sides, L is equal to 600. I'm sorry, 8L is equal to 600. And then dividing both sides by 8 gives us 75. Okay, so loading and unloading. The rate is going to be $75 per hour. And then my mileage charge is going to be $5 per mile. Okay, and that is our answer for example 4. Okay, hopefully that made sense. If any of this was confusing, please go back to the beginning of the recording and listen to it again. Thank you.